You think the worst kind of divorce is when papers are signed? No. The real one happens in silence while you still share the same bed, the same coffee, the same name. I lived that kind of marriage for 20 years, until the day he forgot who I was. And somehow, that's when I found him again. I used to believe silence was peaceful. When Michael and I first bought this house, I loved how quiet the mornings were. The birds outside the kitchen window, the soft creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet, the slow hum of the coffee maker. It all felt like safety, like we were building a calm little world just for us. 27 years later, that same silence feels like punishment. It stretches between us, thick and suffocating, a constant reminder that somewhere along the line, we stopped talking and never noticed when the last real word was spoken. Every morning starts the same. I wake before him, though I'm not sure why anymore. I used to make his lunch, iron his shirts, kiss his cheek before he left for work. Now I just move quietly, as if afraid to wake a stranger. He comes downstairs around 7, already dressed, his hair still damp from the shower. We exchange nods, not words. I pour coffee into his favorite mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Dad" print that Sophie gave him when she was 8, and leave it on the counter. He takes it without thanks, drinks it while scrolling through his phone, and leaves. The sound of the garage door closing is the first and last clear sound of our mornings. I think we started drifting apart after Sophie left for college. Maybe it began earlier, but that was the moment I noticed the empty chair at dinner. With her gone, there was no buffer, no reason to fill the silence. Michael would eat in front of the TV, and I would eat at the kitchen table, pretending to read. I told myself we were just adjusting, that after raising a child for 2 decades, we needed time to rediscover each other, but rediscovery never came. What came instead was quiet resignation, a slow erosion that left us polite, functional, and emotionally extinct. Sometimes I wonder if he notices it too, if he looks at me and sees the same distance I see in him. There's no anger between us, no shouting matches, no slammed doors. Just the soft, invisible ache of indifference. And somehow, that hurts more. Anger means you still care. Silence means you've given up. Last week, Sophie called from New York. She sounded so excited that I almost forgot how tired my voice has become. She said, "Mom, I'm engaged." And my heart leapt for a second. I could hear laughter and city noise in the background. She told me about his name, David, an architect, kind and funny. She said they wanted to get married next summer, maybe in Oregon, so it would be easier for her dad and me to attend. I promised her we'd be there, that we'd help plan everything. I didn't tell her that Michael and I haven't eaten dinner together in years. She doesn't need to know that her parents sleep in the same house, but live in different worlds. When I hung up, I went upstairs and found Michael sitting on the bed, scrolling through emails. I said, "Sophie's getting married." He looked up for half a second, smiled faintly and said, "That's nice." Then he went back to his phone. That was it. No excitement, no warmth. Just 2 words. "That's nice." I stood there for a moment, waiting for something else, but nothing came. The silence that followed filled the room like fog. That night, I dreamed of our wedding day. I could almost smell the rain on the church steps, feel the tremble of his hand as he slipped the ring on my finger. We were so young, so sure. We thought love was about big gestures, about promises that lasted forever. No one tells you that sometimes love dies quietly, without drama, without betrayal, just the slow fading of 2 people who forget how to reach each other. The next morning, I found myself digging through old boxes in the attic. Maybe I was looking for proof that we were once real. There were photo albums, letters, even the first Valentine's card he gave me. His handwriting used to be neat, careful. "To my Laura," one card said, "you make the world quiet in all the right ways." I laughed when I read that. Back then, silence was comfort. Now it's a wall we built and forgot how to tear down. When Michael came home that evening, I was cooking dinner, something I haven't done in a while. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen, and I almost felt nervous, like a hostess expecting a guest. He looked surprised but said nothing. We sat at the table, the same table we'd bought together 25 years ago. The candlelight flickered, shadows moving between us. He ate quietly, occasionally glancing at the clock. I asked him about work. He answered in short sentences. "Busy. Same old stuff. New project starting soon. Every word felt like pulling teeth. I tried to smile, to pretend this was normal. But inside, something was crumbling. I realized I couldn't remember the last time he had looked at me really looked. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he turned on the TV in the living room. The sound of a baseball game echoed faintly down the hall. I wanted to join him, to sit beside him the way we used to. But I didn't. Instead, I stood at the sink, staring at the reflection of my face in the dark window. The woman looking back at me seemed older than I remembered, not just in years, but in spirit. I thought about what Sophie would see when she came home for the wedding. Would she notice the space between her parents? Would she sense that her childhood home had turned into a museum of memories? That night, lying in bed beside Michael, I listened to the rhythm of his breathing. For a moment, I imagined reaching out, resting my hand on his chest like I used to. But fear held me still. What if he flinched? What if he didn't notice? The distance between us wasn't measured in inches, it was measured in years of unspoken words. I turned away and closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I replayed our life like a film on a loop. The first apartment with the leaky faucet, the nights we stayed up talking until dawn, Sophie's first steps, the fights we made up after, the way he used to touch the small of my back when we crossed the street. Small things that once meant love, now ghosts in the house of our silence. The next morning I found an envelope on the kitchen counter. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a letter, medical bills, test results. The hospital's logo printed neatly on the top. My stomach tightened as I read the words. Pulmonary nodules, further testing required. My hands trembled. He hadn't said anything. Of course he hadn't. Michael has always been the kind of man who carries pain quietly, as if speaking it out loud would make it more real. When he came downstairs, I didn't mention it. I wanted to, but the words caught in my throat. He noticed the letter missing but said nothing, just looked at me for a fraction of a second, long enough for me to see the fatigue in his eyes. Then he picked up his jacket, kissed my forehead lightly, and left. It was the first time he'd touched me in years, and it broke me more than the silence ever could. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. About how we'd lived together so long yet knew so little about each other now. If he was sick, did he plan to tell me? Or would he just fade away quietly, the way our marriage had? I didn't know what frightened me more, losing him, or realizing I'd already lost him long ago. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not Sophie, not my sister, not even the woman I sometimes chat with at the market. It sat in my purse for days, folded and refolded, its creases deepening like wrinkles in a secret I wasn't ready to expose. Every time I reached for my wallet, I felt the edge of that paper brush against my fingers, as if reminding me that something irreversible had already begun, but I stayed silent. It felt cruel to bring it up when we could barely talk about the weather. A few nights later, as I was grading papers at the dining table, I heard him cough from upstairs. It was a deep, tearing sound that made my chest tighten. He brushed it off when I asked if he was all right. "Just allergies," he said, his voice rough. He smiled, the kind of half-smile people give when they're trying to end a conversation before it starts. I wanted to press him, to tell him I'd seen the test results, but I didn't. Maybe because I was afraid of what he'd say. Or maybe because I was afraid he wouldn't say anything at all. The next morning, he left earlier than usual. I heard the garage door before the alarm clock even rang. His absence felt heavier than his presence ever had. The silence that filled the house afterward was different, not the cold, habitual kind we'd grown used to, but something closer to dread. I sat at the kitchen table long after he left, staring at the mug he'd forgotten to wash. A coffee ring had dried on the rim, dark and uneven. I couldn't bring myself to clean it. That weekend, Sophie called again. She wanted to talk about the wedding, about colors and venues and guest lists. She asked if her dad and I were excited. I hesitated for too long before answering, and she noticed. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. I told her I was fine, that I was just tired from work. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "You and Dad have always been my example of what a strong marriage looks like." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far from the truth. If only she knew how fragile the walls of her childhood home really were, held together not by love, but by habit and fear of collapse. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I walked downstairs and found him sitting in the dark living room, the television off, the glow from the streetlight cutting across his face. He was holding an old photo album. I recognized it, our honeymoon in Seattle, the one we never finished putting together. For a moment, he looked like the man I used to know. I stood by the doorway, watching him turn the pages slowly, his fingers tracing over images of a life that felt like someone else's. I wanted to sit next to him, to tell him I missed us. But the words got tangled somewhere between my heart and my mouth, so instead, I said softly, "Do you remember that hotel by the pier?" He didn't look up. "The one with the bad coffee," he said. "You spilled it all over the bed." I smiled, surprised that he remembered. "Yeah," I whispered, "that one." Then came the silence again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. Just sad. Familiar. The next day, I followed him to the hospital. I know how that sounds intrusive, maybe even desperate, but I needed to know. I parked across the street and watched him walk in. He looked smaller somehow, slower. When he came back out, I stayed hidden, waiting until he drove off before I went inside. The nurse at the reception desk looked tired but kind. I told her I was his wife. She hesitated, then handed me a pamphlet and said softly, "The doctor will call you soon." I nodded, pretending I already knew what that meant, but I didn't, not really. That evening, when he got home, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I said his name not sharply but carefully, like I was afraid it might shatter. "Michael." He stopped in the hallway, still holding his briefcase. "What did the doctor say?" His face went blank. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he sighed, set the case down, and leaned against the wall. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said. That phrase, "nothing you need to worry about," made something in me snap. "Don't do that," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't shut me out." He looked at me with a tiredness I'd never seen before. "Laura," he said quietly, "we haven't really talked in years. Why start now?" That hurt more than I expected. I wanted to tell him that I never stopped wanting to talk, that I was just waiting for him to open the door first. But instead, I just stood there, tears threatening, and whispered, "Because maybe it's not too late." He didn't reply. He picked up his briefcase, walked into the study, and closed the door. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed, listening to the muffled sound of him moving papers around in the next room. I thought about what he'd said, that we hadn't talked in years. It was true. Somewhere along the way, conversation turned into routine, and routine turned into silence. And now, silence had turned into this two people afraid to admit they were strangers under the same roof. The phone rang the next morning. It was the hospital. The nurse's voice was gentle, rehearsed, the kind used for bad news. She told me his biopsy results were back, stage 4. I don't remember much after that. I think I thanked her. My hands went cold. The kitchen light seemed too bright. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway, watching me. He must have known from my face. He didn't ask what they said. He didn't have to. We just stood there, facing each other, two people who had spent years avoiding eye contact, suddenly unable to look away. He was the one who spoke first. "I didn't want you to find out like this." His voice cracked a little. "I thought if I ignored it, it would go away." I wanted to be angry, to shout, to demand why he'd kept it from me, but all I felt was an aching tenderness, a sudden rush of love mixed with regret. I walked toward him slowly and placed my hand on his arm. He flinched at first, as if surprised by touch, then relaxed. It was the first time in years we'd touched without obligation. "You're not alone," I said, though I wasn't sure if he believed me. He nodded, eyes glossy. "I don't want pity," he said. "Then don't call it that," I whispered. "Call it love, if you still remember what that means." For a long time, we stood in the kitchen like that, two broken people clinging to what little was left. The coffee machine hummed behind us. The morning light crept across the counter. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt alive, fragile, waiting. The following days unfolded in a strange rhythm, as if time itself was unsure whether to move forward or stay suspended in that fragile moment after the truth came out. We didn't talk much about his diagnosis, not at first. The word stage 4 hung between us like a ghost neither of us could bear to acknowledge. He still went to work every morning, though I knew he shouldn't. I didn't stop him. I think we both needed the illusion of normalcy, the fragile comfort of pretending everything was the same, but of course, it wasn't. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the way his shoulders slumped a little more each day, the quiet wheeze in his breath, the half-eaten lunches he brought home. I began cooking again. Small meals, things he used to love, chicken pot pie, vegetable soup, apple crumble. He ate them without comment, but I noticed he always finished the bowl. Sometimes that was enough. One evening, I found him sitting on the porch, wrapped in his old gray sweater, staring at the fading light over the trees. I joined him, bringing 2 cups of tea. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Then he said, almost to himself, "I used to think dying would feel like panic, but it doesn't. It's just quiet." His tone was calm, almost peaceful. I didn't know how to respond. The lump in my throat was too heavy to swallow. I reached out and touched his hand. His skin felt thinner than I remembered. He didn't pull away. That night, lying in bed, I replayed his words over and over. Quiet, always that word. Our marriage had been full of quiet, and now even his dying would be too. I wondered if that was what we'd become, 2 people who couldn't even scream when the world fell apart. A week later, he finally agreed to see a specialist in Portland. The drive there was long, almost 4 hours, and we spent most of it in silence. Occasionally, he pointed out something on the road, a hawk perched on a fence, a truck with a broken taillight, small talk that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. At one point, I reached over to adjust the heater and accidentally brushed his hand. He didn't move it away. It was such a small gesture, but I felt something shift inside me, like the faint sound of ice cracking at the end of winter. The doctor's office was clean and bright, smelling faintly of antiseptic and lemons. The oncologist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, explained everything carefully, compassionately. Words like chemotherapy, prognosis, palliative care floated around the room. I tried to listen, to memorize every detail, but all I could focus on was the way Michael's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. When she asked if we had questions, he said softly, "How much time?" She hesitated before answering. 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. The car ride home was different this time. He didn't look out the window. He just stared straight ahead. Halfway through, I reached for the radio, hoping music might break the weight of silence. A song was already playing, one we used to love, "Here Comes the Sunday." He gave a small laugh, almost bitter. "Guess that's irony for you." I smiled weakly. "Or maybe it's hope," I said. He didn't reply, but when I glanced at him, I saw his jaw unclench slightly, as if he wanted to believe me. When we got home, I went straight to the kitchen, needing something to do with my hands. He lingered in the hallway, looking around as though seeing the house for the first time. The worn couch, the dusty frames, the stack of unopened mail. "We've lived here 20 years, he said quietly. I never realized how tired it looks. I wanted to tell him the house wasn't tired, we were, but instead, I said, maybe it just needs a little love. That night, after dinner, he did something unexpected. He asked if I wanted to take a walk. The last time we'd done that was years ago, back when Sophie was still in high school. We walked down our street in the cool night air, past the neighbors' glowing windows, the hum of sprinklers, the distant barking of a dog. It felt like stepping into an old memory. We didn't hold hands, but our steps fell in sync. At one point, he said, "Do you ever think we gave up too soon?" The question caught me off guard. "On what?" I asked. "On us," he said simply. I wanted to deny it, to say that we hadn't given up, that life had just gotten in the way, but that would have been a lie. "Maybe," I admitted. "Maybe we forgot that love needs maintenance," he nodded. "Like the house." Exactly like the house. When we got back, he seemed lighter somehow, as if the conversation had loosened something inside him. He even made a small joke about how the porch light still flickered after all these years. I laughed a real laugh, and for a fleeting moment, we were us again, the old version, the one before the silence. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of him coughing again. This time it was worse, deep and relentless. I rushed to his side, panic rising. He waved me off, insisting he was fine, but there was blood on the handkerchief he tried to hide. That was the moment I realized how fragile time had become, that every minute mattered now. I sat him down, pressed his hand in mine, and said, We need to call Dr. Patel. He nodded weakly. After he fell asleep that afternoon, I wandered into his study. It smelled like paper and old cologne. On his desk, I found a small notebook. My name was written on the cover in his handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were letters, short, unfinished thoughts addressed to me. Laura, I don't know how to talk to you anymore. I'm sorry for disappearing even when I was right next to you. You deserved more. I pressed the notebook to my chest, tears blurring the words. It hit me then, all the things he hadn't said aloud, all the apologies buried beneath years of quiet. When he woke up, I told him I'd found it. He didn't look embarrassed. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, I started writing that when Sophie left for college. I thought if I couldn't talk to you, maybe I could at least write to you. I asked why he stopped. Because at some point, he said softly, I thought you didn't want to hear from me anymore. That night, I sat beside his bed while he slept, the notebook open on my lap. The words inside it were raw, imperfect, human. I realized then that our silence hadn't been born of hatred, it was fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of reopening wounds. But now, as I looked at his frail body, I knew I would rather face 1,000 wrong words than lose the chance to speak at all. So I began to write him back. In that same notebook, under his last line, I wrote, I never stopped wanting to hear from you. I was just waiting for you to start talking again. The morning after I wrote in his notebook, I left it on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup, just as I used to leave him love notes in our early years of marriage. Back then, the notes were playful reminders to pick up milk, doodles of hearts, or a simple, I miss you already. This one was different. It was a confession, a plea wrapped in calm words. When I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, I froze. I wanted to see his reaction, but I also couldn't bear it, so I stepped outside into the garden, pretending to water the plants. The air was cool, the kind that carries the faint smell of rain. I stood among the overgrown roses, their petals pale from neglect. Through the window, I saw him stop at the table, his hand hovering over the notebook. He read my words slowly, his brow tightening. Then, to my surprise, he sat down. For several minutes, he didn't move, just stared at the page as though trying to absorb it. When he finally looked up and saw me through the glass, our eyes met. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. That small moment that held gaze felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years. Later that day, he joined me outside. He was wrapped in his cardigan despite the Sunday. You still take care of these? He asked, nodding at the roses. I said yes, though we both knew I hadn't for months. He knelt beside me, his movements slow but steady. You were always better with things that needed patience, he said. I smiled faintly. And you were better at fixing what was broken. He chuckled, a dry, quiet sound. Not everything, apparently. We worked in silence for a while, trimming dead leaves, pulling out weeds. But it wasn't the old, heavy silence. This one felt companionable, alive. The kind of quiet that holds meaning instead of emptiness. When we finished, he looked at the garden and said, It's strange. You take care of something long enough, and even when you stop, it remembers how to bloom. I knew he wasn't just talking about the roses. That evening we sat together on the porch again, a blanket draped across both our knees. He asked if I still painted. I told him I hadn't in years. You should, he said. It made you happy. I looked at him, surprised. You remember that? He nodded. I remember a lot of things, Laura. I just stopped saying them out loud. The way he said it made my heart ache. Why? I asked quietly. He shrugged. Maybe because life became too ordinary. Work, bills, groceries. I thought love was supposed to survive on its own, like it didn't need feeding. But silence, he paused. Silence eats everything if you let it. That night, I took out my old sketchbook from the closet. The pages smelled of dust and turpentine. The last sketch inside was of Sophie as a child, her face half finished. My pencil moved almost on its own, tracing lines that felt both new and familiar. When I looked up, Michael was watching from the doorway. It's beautiful, he said softly. I laughed, embarrassed. It's not done. He smiled. Neither are we. A few weeks passed, and he began his treatment. The hospital became a second home, the antiseptic smell, the fluorescent lights, the endless waiting. I sat beside him through every session. Sometimes we talked, but often we didn't need to. I'd read aloud from books he used to love: Steinbeck, Hemingway, though half the time I think he just listened to the sound of my voice rather than the words themselves. One afternoon, during a particularly long wait, he said, "Do you think Sophie will remember us like this?" I asked what he meant. "Together," he said. "Even if it's late." I told him she would. But deep down, I wondered what memory she'd hold on to the parents who laughed together at the dinner table, or the ones who barely spoke across it. When I told Sophie about her father's illness, she cried for a long time. Over the phone, she said, "I wish I could come home right now." I told her to stay, to focus on her life. "Your dad wants to see you happy," I said, even though part of me wanted to beg her to come. After that call, Michael looked at me from his chair and said, "You didn't tell her how bad it is, did you?" I shook my head. "Not yet." He nodded slowly. "Good. Let her keep the picture of me she remembers before all this." His voice trembled slightly. "I don't want her last memory to be me hooked up to machines." I reached over and took his hand. "Then we'll make new ones," I said. That weekend, I suggested we go to the coast. It was a spontaneous idea, something I hadn't done in years. To my surprise, he agreed. The drive was long, and he tired easily, but the moment we saw the ocean, his eyes lit up. The waves crashed against the shore, wild and endless. We sat on a weathered bench, watching the horizon. "You know," he said, "I used to think the sea was terrifying. No control, no end. But now I think it's kind of honest. It gives and takes, without pretending to be anything else." I smiled. Maybe that's what love should have been. He looked at me, the corners of his eyes soft. Maybe it still can be. We stayed until sunset. The sky turned gold, then bruised purple. I could feel his hand trembling in mine, his breath shallow from the cold. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and for the first time in so long, I felt peace. Not the hollow silence we'd lived with, but the kind that comes when everything unnecessary has fallen away. When we returned home that night, I helped him into bed. Before turning off the light, he whispered, "Thank you, Laura." "For what?" I asked. "For waiting," he said. I lay awake long after he fell asleep, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. His face in the dim light looked younger, almost like the man I married. I thought about all the years we lost to pride and fear, the conversations we never had. And yet here we were, at the end of everything, finally learning how to speak again. In the weeks that followed our trip to the coast, time began to stretch and fold in strange ways. The days felt longer, yet every evening seemed to arrive too quickly. I became aware of the smallest sounds, the kettle whistling, the creak of the stairs, the faint hum of his breathing at night. Michael's illness was unpredictable. Some mornings he was strong enough to make coffee, and others he couldn't lift his arms without trembling. I learned to move quietly, not out of fear, but reverence. Every movement felt sacred now. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found a stack of letters. They were tied together with a blue ribbon, faded and fraying at the edges. The handwriting was his sharp, slanted, unmistakable. My heart skipped. The first letter was dated July 1987, the summer after we married. It began, "Laura, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say things out loud somewhere." Each letter was like a window into a version of him I hadn't seen in years. He wrote about the fear of failing me, the joy he felt when Sophie was born, the loneliness that crept in when work took over his life. In one, he confessed, "I stopped talking because I thought silence was easier than saying the wrong thing." But the truth is, silence became the wrong thing. I read them sitting on the floor, the dust motes swirling around me like ghosts. By the time I finished, tears had soaked through the paper. That evening, I placed the letters on the nightstand beside his bed. When he saw them, his face froze. "Where did you find those?" he asked quietly. "In the attic," I said. "You never sent them." He looked down, shame flickering across his eyes. "I didn't know how," he whispered. "Back then I thought love was something you proved, not something you spoke. But I was wrong, wasn't I?" I reached out and touched his cheek. "You were never wrong about love," I said. "Just quiet about it." He smiled faintly, and for the first time, he took one of the letters and began reading aloud. His voice was weaker now, but steady. Hearing his words, his younger voice spill into the room was like watching sunlight return to a place long forgotten. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "You know, I wrote these because I didn't trust time. I thought maybe words on paper could hold something longer than we could." I didn't know what to say. Instead, I climbed into bed beside him and rested my head on his shoulder. "Then let's write one together," I whispered. He looked surprised, but he nodded. Over the next few days, we began what we called the Book of Truth. It was just a plain journal, its pages filling slowly with the things we had never said. Some entries were light memories of our first apartment, our disastrous attempt at cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Others were heavier, regrets, apologies, confessions of moments when we both turned away instead of toward each other. It was painful and healing all at once. There was one entry I hesitated to write. It was about Sophie, how she had grown distant in the years when our marriage felt hollow. I wrote, "She learned silence from us, Michael. We taught her love without sound." When he read it, his eyes filled with tears. "We still have time," he said. "Let's teach her something else now." The next weekend, Sophie came home. I hadn't expected it. She simply showed up at the door, suitcase in hand, her eyes red but determined. "I couldn't stay away," she said. When she saw her father, she froze for a moment, then rushed to him. They held each other for what felt like forever, both crying, both laughing through it. I stood back watching them, my chest tight with something between grief and gratitude. That evening, the three of us sat together in the living room. The same room that had witnessed years of cold dinners and unspoken words now glowed with soft light and the faint scent of cinnamon tea. Sophie told stories from her life in New York, the chaos of the subway, the long hours at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Michael listened with such attention that I almost forgot how fragile he was now. At one point, Sophie turned to me and said, "Mom, I used to think you stayed because you were afraid, but now I think you stayed because you believed there was still something worth saving." I didn't answer right away. "Maybe both are true," I said finally. "Sometimes love is brave, sometimes it's just stubborn." That night, after Sophie went to bed, Michael and I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the hallway. "You did good," he said softly. "With her, with us." I shook my head. "We did what we could." He smiled faintly. "That's more than most people ever do." In the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of him breathing unevenly. I turned on the lamp and touched his hand. His skin was cold, his pulse weak but steady. He opened his eyes slowly. "Laura," he murmured, "promise me something." "Anything," I said. "When I go, don't let silence fill the house again. Keep the sound of life in it. Music, laughter, anything but quiet." Tears blurred my vision. "I promise," I whispered. He smiled a soft, tired smile. "Good. Because silence, it's what broke us. Don't let it break you too." I lay beside him until dawn, holding his hand, listening to his breath fade into the rhythm of the waking world. He passed away on a Thursday morning, just as the first light began to touch the curtains. The nurse had warned me the night before that it could happen soon, but no one ever really knows what soon means when it comes to losing someone. I had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, my fingers still intertwined with his. When I opened my eyes, the room was unbearably still, that heavy kind of silence that doesn't just fill space, it swallows it. His face was peaceful, almost weightless, like he had simply drifted off into a dream. For a long time, I couldn't move. The sunlight slid across his blanket, turning the wrinkles in the fabric into golden rivers. I wanted to memorize that moment, not the death, but the calm, the strange grace of it. I whispered his name once, twice, not to wake him, but to hear how it still sounded in the air. Then I pressed my forehead to his hand, still warm, and said the only words that came, "Thank you for coming back before you left." The days after blurred together in fragments. People arrived with casseroles, flowers, polite condolences that hovered somewhere between sincerity and obligation. Sophie took care of most things she called the funeral home, spoke with the doctor, filled out the forms. I watched her, a mixture of strength and exhaustion in every gesture, and realized how much she had grown into someone I barely knew but deeply admired. At the service, the church was half full: neighbors, colleagues, a few distant relatives. I stood at the front, my hands trembling as I read a passage from one of Michael's old letters. "Love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how much of yourself you leave inside another person. When I looked up, Sophie was crying quietly in the front row, and for the first time, I felt the weight of all that he had left inside me, the years, the lessons, the silences, and the words we finally learned to say. After everyone left, Sophie and I stayed behind. The church smelled of wax and dust, and the echo of our footsteps followed us down the aisle. She reached for my hand. "Do you think he knew how much you loved him?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but more importantly, I think he finally knew I forgave him." She nodded slowly. "And you? Did you forgive yourself?" The question hung in the air. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a single act, it's a daily choice, like breathing. "I'm learning to," I said finally, "one day at a time." When we got home, the house felt too quiet. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. I remembered my promise, no silence, so I turned on the old record player. The needle crackled before settling into an old jazz tune, one we used to dance to when we were young. The sound filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sophie smiled faintly. "He hated this song," she said. "I know," I said, laughing through the tears, "but I loved it enough for both of us." We spent that evening in the living room, sorting through boxes of memories, old photographs, postcards, the book of truth we had written together. When Sophie opened it and started reading, her voice trembled. "You two really wrote everything in here," she said, "even the bad parts." "That's the only way it works," I told her. "If you leave out the cracks, you miss where the light gets in." That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into his study, the place that had once been his refuge, the room where silence had lived longest. On the desk sat his old notebook, the one I had written in months ago. I opened it, half expecting blank pages, but found something new inside. His handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. It said, "You were right, Laura. Silence was easy, but you were worth the noise." I sank into his chair and let the tears come. Not the violent kind, but soft, steady ones that seemed to wash everything clean. For the first time since he died, I didn't feel empty. I felt full of him, of us, of everything we'd lost and found again too late, but still somehow in time. The next morning, I decided to keep my promise properly. I opened every window in the house. I let the wind in, the sound of cars passing, birds arguing in the garden. I brewed coffee, just for me this time, and set 2 cups on the table out of habit. Old routines die hard. As I sipped, I looked outside and saw the rosebush we had tended together months ago. It was blooming wildly now, petals spilling over the edge like it had been waiting for permission to live again. I went outside, knelt beside it, and whispered, "You remembered." A few days later, Sophie found me painting again. The canvas was half-finished streaks of blue and gold, forming an ocean that could have been anywhere, anytime. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's the sea," I told her. "The day we went to the coast." She leaned in closer. "You're painting him?" "No," I said, dipping my brush into the light. "I'm painting what stayed after." That afternoon, we painted together. She wasn't much of an artist, but she laughed when her brush slipped, leaving uneven strokes across the canvas. The house echoed with sound, laughter, conversation, the clink of brushes in jars of water. And in that moment, I realized I had kept my promise. The silence that once haunted us was gone. In its place was life imperfect, noisy, beautiful life. That night, before bed, I whispered into the empty space beside me, "You were right, Michael. Words do last longer than we do." And somehow I swear I heard his voice, faint but certain, saying back, "Then keep writing." It has been 6 months since Michael's passing, and the house feels different now, lighter, warmer, like it has learned how to breathe again. The garden has grown wild in the best way, and every morning I make coffee and sit by the window, watching the light crawl across the floorboards. The ache of grief still lives inside me, but it has changed shape. It's no longer a weight pressing on my chest. It's more like a pulse, a quiet reminder that love doesn't end when someone leaves. It just changes where it lives. I've started painting regularly again. What began as a way to fill time has become a kind of therapy, or maybe even prayer. My studio, once a cluttered storage room, now smells of oil paint, turpentine, and morning air. I paint oceans mostly. Endless horizons. Sometimes I paint the sea from that last trip we took together. Sometimes it's something imagined, a world where the water never stops moving. Every painting feels like a conversation with him. And in each one, I try to capture the space between silence and sound, that fragile moment where both can coexist without destroying each other. Sophie visits every weekend now. She says she likes keeping an eye on me, but I can tell she needs it too. Sometimes we cook together, or rather, she cooks, and I supervise from the counter, pretending to know better. We talk about everything: her work, her new apartment, the patients she cares for. One evening, as we were washing dishes, she said, "You know, Mom, I used to be scared that I'd end up like you and Dad, loving someone but never really saying it." I smiled, drying a plate. "Then don't be. Say it, even when it's messy, especially then." She nodded, thoughtful. "Do you think he knew at the end that you loved him that much?" I paused, remembering his last words, the faint smile on his lips, the promise I made. "Yes," I said softly. "He knew, and I think he loved me even more for saying it out loud." That night, after she went to bed, I sat in my studio and opened the Book of Truth. The pages were worn now, the ink faded in places, but the words still felt alive. I flipped to the last entry, where he had written, "When I go, don't stop living. Don't build a shrine out of our love. Let it move, let it breathe." So I added one more page beneath it. My handwriting was uneven, the letters trembling, but clear. "I'm learning, Michael." The house is loud again. The roses are blooming. Sophie laughs like you used to. And me? I'm still here loving you out loud. I closed the book and placed it on the shelf, between two of his favorite novels. I didn't cry this time. There was peace in the act, like closing a door that no longer needed to stay open, yet knowing you could always walk through it again. Spring turned to summer. The days grew long, and one afternoon, while cleaning the porch, I found his old camera tucked behind a box. I remembered how he used to take photos of everything: meals, sunsets, even the cracks in the sidewalk. I cleaned the lens, loaded a roll of film, and decided to start where he left off. That weekend, Sophie and I drove to the coast again. The same bench was still there, weathered but standing. I set the camera on the tripod and looked through the viewfinder. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, just like it had that day. Sophie stood beside me, smiling in the golden light. "You ready?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and pressed the shutter. The sound, that small, satisfying click, felt like the world exhaling. We stayed until the sun melted into the sea. The waves rolled in, soft and slow, and I thought about how time has its own rhythm, how love, grief, and healing all move at their own pace, colliding and separating like the tide. As we walked back to the car, Sophie slipped her hand into mine. "You okay, Mom?" she asked. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm still living." That night, back home, I developed the film. Most of the photos were of the ocean, but one made me stop. It was of the empty bench by the water. The sunlight hit it just right, and for a moment it looked as if someone were sitting there, a faint shadow, a blur, or maybe just the wind catching the light. I smiled, touched the image, and whispered, "I see you." The next morning, I hung the photo on the wall above my desk. It wasn't a shrine, just a reminder that love doesn't vanish. It lingers in the air, in the sound of waves, in the quiet spaces between words. Now when I paint, I sometimes hum, sometimes I sing. The house, once defined by silence, has learned its music again. And on certain evenings, when the light fades just right and the garden hums with life, I swear I can feel him there, not as a ghost, but as a presence made of memory and air and everything we never stopped being. And for the first time, I understand what he meant. Silence doesn't have to be empty. It can be full of gratitude, of love, of all the things we were brave enough to finally say. The first anniversary of Michael's passing arrived quietly, without the ceremony or dread I had once imagined it would bring. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, and instead of sorrow, I felt a strange calmness, like the house and I had come to an understanding. Grief no longer surprised me. It had become part of my daily rhythm, something that walked beside me instead of chasing me. I made 2 cups of coffee, as I always did, setting one across from me at the table. It wasn't habit anymore, it was gratitude, a small ritual of remembrance. Outside, the roses were in full bloom, wild and unapologetic. I smiled, thinking how he used to tease me about overwatering them. "You can't drown something that loves rain," I used to say. I still whispered it sometimes, to no one in particular. Later that day, Sophie came over with a box in her hands. "I have something for you," she said, her eyes shining. Inside was a framed photo, the picture from the beach, the one with the empty bench, and the hint of a shadow that looked almost human. Beneath it, she'd written a single line: "Love stays." I felt my throat tighten. "It's perfect," I said softly. She nodded. "I thought it belonged here." We hung it in the hallway, where the sunlight touched it every morning. It felt right, not an altar, but a continuation. That evening, we decided to cook one of Michael's favorite dinners: roast chicken, garlic potatoes, and red wine. The kitchen filled with laughter, music, and the comforting chaos of pots and clattering dishes. Sophie burned the potatoes, and I spilled wine on the counter, and we both laughed so hard we had to stop to catch our breath. It was exactly the kind of mess he would have loved. After dinner, we sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around us, just like Michael and I used to. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of jasmine. Sophie leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know, Mom," she said, "I used to think grief was about forgetting less and less each day, but now I think it's about remembering differently." I turned to her, proud of the woman she'd become. "You're right," I said. "It's not about holding on to the pain, it's about keeping the love." She smiled. "That's what you taught me." After she went home that night, I stayed outside a while longer. The stars were bright, the kind of clear night that makes the world feel bigger and smaller at the same time. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived in this house: the young bride, the mother, the silent wife, the widow, and now, something new, someone whole. I realized then that the silent divorce, what I had once called the slow, wordless unraveling of our marriage, wasn't really about separation at all. It was about the long road back to understanding that love isn't measured in constant harmony, but in the willingness to listen through the quiet. I went back inside and sat at my desk, where the book of truth still waited. I opened to the last page, where my final entry had ended, and beneath it I wrote, "You were right, Michael. Silence wasn't the enemy. It was just the space waiting to be filled. And now it is with laughter, with memory, with the sound of our daughter's voice, with the sea still moving beyond everything we were. I'm not afraid of quiet anymore, because now it's full of you." I closed the book, ran my hand across the cover, and placed it beside the photo from the beach. The two of them belonged together, words and image, sound and stillness. As I turned off the lights, I whispered one last time into the room, "Good night, my love." And in the hush that followed, I didn't hear an answer, but I didn't need to. Because the silence no longer felt empty, it felt alive. I walked upstairs, leaving the music of the house humming behind me, the ticking of the clock, the rustle of curtains, the faint creak of old wood. All of it, together, was the sound of life continuing. And for the first time, I understood that this was never a story about loss, but about the kind of love that survives its own ending.